All right, folks, I ask you to take a seat, or if you're sticking around for this one, we are on a tighter schedule on this next hour. This is the Fish, Wildlife, and Plant Ecology 2 session. I don't know. All right, so for everyone that's sticking around, if you weren't here for one of the other sessions I've been talking to you for, my name is Matt Raby. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Nebraska Ecological Services Field Office. First up today, real quick reminder, for Q&A, we may have even less time after this one, but please do put them online in the Q&A session. Even if we don't get to them, the speakers can go ahead and input answers on there. Our first speaker today is Stephen Jones, teen naturalist, program coordinator, and field volunteer trainer at Boulder County Audubon Society. And he's going to be speaking to us about 38 years of continuity and change at a Sandhills wildlife area.
I'm going to give us about another minute here, make sure people can settle. Some went to the bathroom, so. So the first time I visited Smith Lake Wildlife Management Area in the Sandhills south of Rushville, the place seemed a little too tame for my taste. It may have been the merry-go-round in the slide, I'm not sure. The second time in early June, I watched an osprey spearing fish from an inlet and then came across a giant snapping turtle laying her eggs right by the entrance road. So I was beginning to like the place a little bit. So I pitched my tent on the edge of the woods, hardly guessing that over the next 38 years, I'd spend more than 300 nights camping by myself in this peaceful spot. I fell in love with the glowing light and the sense of wildness when afternoon thunderstorms rumbled through. The shell-leaf penstemons coated with raindrops, and entire hillsides sprinkled with spiderwort blossoms, which are delicious, by the way, if you haven't tried them. I kept bumping into wildlife in unexpected places, such as the Wildlife Area Entrance Road, and in the pines behind my tent, where a family of locally rare long-eared owls perched on an old crow's nest. And then there was this white-tailed deer who kept walking up to within 3 feet of me when I was propped against a tree reading a book. I guess you're all familiar with this behavior, but I didn't know what to make of it until I realized she was just gently telling me that she had a fawn lying out in the grass nearby and was gently telling me to move on. And the nights felt serene with great horned, long-eared, and eastern screech owls calling in chorus. The light of autumn was just as glowing and the hills were just as full of wildlife. At dawn, metallic green sweat bees bedded down amid wild licorice fruits, and sleeping saddlebags dragonflies glistened in the first sunlight. Getting close to the blooming tall grasses was a real revelation for me. I love the brilliant yellow stamens of these big blue stem blossoms and those magenta sticky stigmas as well. And in this next one, my favorite prairie wildflower is switchgrass. You can almost feel the stigmas stretching out to catch passing grains of pollen. And then at the end of the August, I was amazed that the hills were still green. This is the Sandhills feature and coated with sunflowers. The crisp light of October seems almost transcendent to me. Sand bluestem seeds just shimmer at dawn. And bronze copper butterflies remind me of precious jewels. Recently emerged monarch butterflies sip on nectar from goldenrod flowers before taking off for Michoacan. And in the evening, they're followed south by flocks of sandhill cranes. And I think it was when I stood on the lakeshore by myself one evening and wave after wave of sandhill cranes passed over that I finally got it, that this unassuming little state wildlife area has been a sacred place to generation after generation of diverse people for thousands of years. I began camping at Smith Lake just in December, just 4 years ago. And when I arrived, I was greeted by 7 calling owls and the crackling and groaning of the surface ice. And when I woke the next morning, I heard a cacophony at the south end of the lake, and here were 1,000 or more Canada and cackling geese gathered around a small hole in the ice. And when I got closer, here was the first family of trumpeter swans I'd ever seen at Smith Lake in 35 years. But there's one time of the year you can always find me at Smith Lake. I do a breeding bird survey, and I've done it for 25 years, and that's why I came here, because I thought it might be of interest to you to know what the results are. On 2 mornings during the first week in June, I go out and, using breeding bird atlas protocols, try to find all the potential breeding birds I can. And if you didn't work on the atlas, we code them as possible, probable, or confirmed based on their behavior and the habitat where we find them. Here are the results. Now, I expect an ooh or an ah there at that number 124. For the Colorado Breeding Bird Atlas, the first atlas, we surveyed 1,700 10-square-mile blocks in the state of Colorado. We had one block with more than 100 potential nesting species. Smith Lake is 1 square mile. It's partially its location in the center of North America. It's the diversity of the ecosystems there, and it's also because there's so little human disturbance. Of course, when you work on something for 25 years and hundreds of hours, you're going to see all sorts of birds that probably don't nest there. And I think the ones in the top list are probably mostly vagrants and migrants. But if you look at the second list, if I can wheel around, you'll see 4 confirmed nesters, including the trumpeter swans, but also 2 human associates, the house finch and the collar dove. And then also, I think we have Bell's vireo up here, which is reflective of the trees moving across the plain. We're starting to get more eastern species in these western areas. Well, I also do point count surveys. I have 10 point count stations located on the quieter western side of the lake. Some are in the pine woodlands that were planted by ranchers about 80 years ago. Some are in the riparian woodlands, some out on the dunes, and some along the lake shore. And I do just a 10-minute count once a year. Well, you can see this line is flat. So the first take-home message here is there hasn't been a change in the number of species I've seen from these point count stations in 25 years. This one shows individuals, and it's almost flat, but look at that big peak in 2003, and those of you who live here should remember 2003 very well, and that will be a theme as I move along here. So the increasers include turkey vultures who built a nest right above one of my point count stations, as well as great crested flycatchers, which are also moving westward, as the trees move here. But you'll also see 2 marsh birds and 2 grassland species here, and I want to talk about those briefly. So marsh wrens are increasing throughout much of North America, but something's going on at Smith Lake. And the thing that I noticed is there are areas on the southwest shore where the cattail vegetation has been greatly reduced during the past 10 years, and that's where marsh wrens nest. In fact, half of the yellow-headed blackbirds I was seeing at Smith Lake nested on a cattail island 50 meters offshore, and that's been completely washed away. And it took me a long time to understand what was happening, but I think this is it. So it turns out that hydrological studies conducted on the Western Plains show that you don't need much of a raising of water levels in our natural lakes before wave action from summer thunderstorms washes away cattails. We did a study at Boulder Reservoir and found that we only had to raise it about 20 or 30 centimeters. And if you had a wet year with lots of thunderstorms, you began to lose your cattail marshes. During the first 15 years, I expected to see long-billed curlews during every survey. I've only seen one during the past 6 years, although I do hear them calling all the time from the neighboring ranch. And I haven't seen many grasshopper sparrows, but this is still a scary graph. Grasshopper sparrows are really declining throughout North America as grasslands are replaced with croplands. But of course, that's not happening at Smith Lake. So something else must be going on here, and I think this is it. So on the left are the grasslands of Smith Lake, and on the right is the Hinn Ranch. And some of you will already have guessed that the grasslands at Smith Lake haven't been grazed in 30 or 40 years. So you've got this very rank vegetation. And all our grassland birds evolved with grazers. Curlews and grasshopper sparrows like bare ground where they can find insects, and they don't like these real tall grasses. They like more spatially spaced out grasses. I think many of you have read the bird studies at Concept Prairie, and they show that areas that are grazed and burned produce the highest species composition and the highest numbers of birds on the property, whereas areas that are neither burned nor grazed produce the lowest numbers. And again, this makes sense because these birds evolved with both fire and grazing. And then, of course, we have the famous tree invasion. These are mostly eastern red cedars, and these have mostly grown in the 40 years I've been going to Smith Lake. I don't know if there was a recent study of burrowing owls in Alberta, and they just won't nest. If they see a tree within 100 meters of where they're considering nesting, they'll leave that place right away. And curlews are the same way, because trees are just like feeding stations for predators. So I'm sure that's affected the grassland birds as well. Okay, let's get back to this business about the peaks and valleys. Again, remember 2003, it was the 3rd year of the worst drought to hit most of the Western Plains since the 1950s. And look at look at 2009 and 2008 here. See, the numbers are quite low. What was that? That was the end of the wettest period the Western Sandhills have experienced in the last 40 years. To show you, to dramatize this, while I was seeing fewer birds at Smith Lake, this is what Whitman Road looked like, 40 miles away, and this is what Lakeside Road looked like. That's where all my marsh birds are. They're standing on Lakeside Road. So this is so counterintuitive, it really intrigued me. We're always hearing drought, drought, drought. Everywhere I go, I'm hearing about the drought, even if there isn't a drought. Drought, drought, drought means we lose our wildlife populations. Well, in this case, it seemed like the opposite was occurring, so I just did a simple graph. I graphed individuals seen in a given year against 3-year cumulative precipitation for the previous 3 years, and this is one of the more powerful correlations I've seen. So the drier it gets, the more birds there are at Smith Lake. So these cattail marshes can be pretty, but they tend to be very thin. They're sort of like strip malls for birds with not much on either side of great interest. So during these wet years, the interdunar valleys fill up with wetlands. And this multidimensional marsh is much more appealing to me as a marsh wren than the strip mall marsh at Smith Lake. But it dries out. After a year or two, these marshes revert to grasslands, and the birds are forced to return to the lakeside marshes. These conclusions look very obvious, but I just want to say two things. We tend to get carried away with megatrends like climate change, and we forget to look at the natural relationships that are going on all the time, and this is one of them, and it's intimately connected to the High Plains aquifer. When the aquifer comes up, the birds go out to the interdunar marshes to nest. When it goes down, they go to the big lakes. To conclude, what else is going on at Smith Lake? The one change I've seen that I would equate to climate change is the quality of the surface water. There seems to be a lot more green algae. Blue-green algae is becoming an issue in the fishery. And of course, we have the famous curly-leaf pondweed, which is infested many of our Sandhills lakes and also degrades fish and waterfowl habitat. And we have the smooth brome, which is flourishing and moving up gradually into the dunes. But I wouldn't want to exaggerate those trends, because in all the time I've spent there, this is the image that's in my mind. Image of natural grasslands dominated by native species and dominated by a bird population whose species composition has hardly changed in 40 years. Upland sandpipers still perch on dune top fence posts. Long-eared owls still nest in the pines. Trumpeter swans have returned to nest for the first time in 100 years. And the sunsets and sunrises remain glowing and, for me, full of promise. So we all should thank the Smith family. They were homesteaders in the 1880s. They donated a section of their land to Colorado Parks and Wildlife with a stipulation that it be managed as wildlife habitat in perpetuity. And I want to thank many of the experts who've helped me with my project. I think you know all of them. And it's been a pleasure to do it. And finally, here is the new book. This one's a lot more personal than The Last Prairie. And it's sort of a tribute to what I consider the most magnificent, welcoming, and resilient ecosystem I know of on the Great Plains. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Stephen. Next up, we've got Mark Pegg, professor and fish ecologist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and he's going to be giving us a talk on pallid sturgeon movements in the Platte River.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing a fish squeezer to grace your presence for a few minutes. And let's buckle up, because I just ate a tub full of nibs and Skittles. So if I run around the room, it's nothing personal, okay? I was going to throw, Andy's not here, I was going to throw Andy under the bus, but I'm not going to do that. So let's see. So this talk is a bit more of a prelude to kind of where we're heading in the next few years. I'll kind of put it into context and where we're headed for with the work that we're doing with the Platte River Recovery and Implementation Program. All right, the one that's the big arrow. So just before I get into that, obviously I'm not the only one that's doing any of the heavy lifting. The two grad students, Jenna and Chris, are actually out on the river right now trying to catch some more pallids, and then John Spurgeon at the co-op unit is involved in this project as well, along with a whole cadre of other folks here in Kearney and Game and Parks. The Missouri River folks are involved as well. Just to give you a bit of background, sturgeon have been around for a couple of years. 200 or 250 million years, so that puts them about at the same time as the emergence of the dinosaurs. Sturgeons, as you probably all know, across the globe have been harvested for their caviar. lots of other issues going on with them, but they are listed by the IUCN as one of the most critically endangered aquatic taxa. So the story that I'll tell you today isn't much different than, well, I guess I'm not going to tell you the story of how they got threatened or endangered, but the story is the same for about all the sturgeon species that we have in the world. Specifically related to pallid sturgeon, they're fluvial specialists, so that means they like shifting, sandy, braided river systems to some extent. Long-lived. There's some studies now that show that they're actually up in the Yellowstone Reach. There's fish that were alive pre-World War II, before the A-bomb. So they're well over 60 years. They mature late, relatively speaking, for fish, 10-ish years, give or take, depending on the sugar's kicking in. So the males will mature a little bit earlier than the females, but generally about 10 years. They spawn infrequently, so they have evolved to these kind of ephemeral states, if you will, where we have floods and droughts, and they can hold on to reproduction till the conditions are right, which has helped them in some ways and maybe harmed them in other ways. They aren't all that fecund in terms of fish species anyway, so there's not a lot of when they do spawn, there's not a lot of offspring for them to be out there trying to survive. And the biggie, at least one of the biggies here, is they're highly migratory. I'll show you a couple graphs in a second, but they move a lot. And to put the final touch on it, they were listed as a federally endangered species back in 1990. So the blue line here represents what we think is the historical range. So it goes all the way up into Montana, all the way down to one of my favorite cities, New Orleans. So, and we're talking about Platte River today, so there is a little nub in here that has Platte River and pallid sturgeon connections. So I'm not going to get into the wheres and what fors and why nots, but in relation to why this species was listed as an endangered, the Fish and Wildlife Service has kind of 5 categories that have to be met in some certain way. Threats, there was some habitat changes along the way, and I'll show you a couple of pictures of that in a second. Overuse wasn't as big a deal with pallid sturgeon until we actually separated out pallids and shovel-nosed sturgeon. Then there's the listing now with similarity of appearance. They look very much like a shovel-nosed sturgeon, so where those two species overlap, there's no commercial harvest any longer. Disease, predation, lots of things going on with that. Water quantity, quality, management, the usual suspects, I guess. And then hybridization is now, I guess we don't need to go back to there, but there's some other factors involved in what may be leading to some concern for them. So to get around to why the Platte River, and I'll come to that in a second, but I just want to show, this is a time sequence in the upper left here this is both the same view from the Missouri River, 1934. The Missouri was a braided channel, lots of sandbars out there, looked a lot like the Platte on a much larger scale. And then as we step through time, 1935, 1940s, 1970s, we see the channelization taking its intended effect from an engineering standpoint. So we've homogenized that channel and changed what was a pretty braided wide channel into a fairly narrow one, and so that's partly the habitat loss that led to our issues. So that brings me to the Platte, and in the lower part of the river, we still have some semblance of those sandbar complexes. If you've driven over the Platte, pretty much anywhere between Lincoln and Omaha, that there's plenty of sandbars out there, and at least in my view, I think of the Platte River as a kind of a smaller version of what maybe the Missouri looked like pre-management. So in some ways, we have some bits that maybe look like, at least in our view, what the fish need, the pallid sturgeon that evolved into this kind of braided, shifting substrate type of system. So that a few years ago led us to start to do some work on Pallid sturgeon, and actually some other folks before I got to UNL started Pallid work in the Platte River at Peters. This is a compilation of where we've caught Pallid sturgeon through, come back here, from 2009 to 2012. In this segment 1, which is essentially 0 river kilometer is the mouth, to about 50 or 60 or so is the Elkhorn River confluence, and then above the Elkhorn confluence here, this dashed line, up to the loop power return, so Columbus essentially. So we caught about 130, 40 Pallid sturgeon over that 5-year period or so. A lot of them in the lower part of the river, but we do have a few that have moved up, and we have anecdotal evidence of that happening beyond with angler catches and whatnot. And then we've actually got some more contemporary data that shows that they are certainly above the Elkhorn as well nowadays. So what I didn't talk about in the recovery plan is there's a propagation effort, and that's a pretty big effort. So a lot of the fish that we're seeing, and that's been going on since the late 1990s, so a lot of the fish we're seeing in the Platte River in the 2009 to 12 range were hatchery produced individuals. There still are a few wild fish out there from that time period, and then we don't have genetic information for a few of them based on a little bit of a snafu at the hatchery on collecting some stuff. But we have a mix of hatchery and reared fish. And I'll come back around to that in a second as well when we get to more of what we're doing now. So just to come back, I guess, to the highly migratory side of things, this graph is the number, it's an individual pallid, so each dot is an individual fish. And the y-axis is the number or amount of kilometers they moved from where they were stocked. So we see, and these were all fish that we caught in the Platte River. So you see a lot of fish that didn't move a whole lot once we caught them. They were stocked pretty close to the mouth of the Platte. But you see some real mover champions up here in the 600 to 700 kilometer range of movements, and that's not an uncommon thing for any of the pallids. There's active telemetry going on in the Missouri River now, and they're documenting these kinds of movements on a fairly regular basis. Not all of the fish are doing that. Obviously, we've got some that stay home, some that are kind of moving a little bit, and then the big ones that go long distances. But again, these were all hatchery fish. To give you a sense of where that actually means, this map shows for fish that we caught in 2009 to 2012 that were released, they were stocked at Boonville, Missouri. We caught 10 individuals that were stocked in that location, not all the same year, but 10 representing that stocking location. The farthest upstream in the Platte that we caught was a fish in Lashara, so above the Elkhorn. And that was about 740 kilometers. So again, they're big movers, at least in my view. Maybe not as many as cranes and terns, but still a bunch. And so the other one that's kind of interesting here is this one that was stocked up at Standing Bear. It actually moved through the reservoir at Lewis and Clark Lake on the Missouri River, down the Missouri River, and then into, we caught that one at about Cedar Creek. So it moved about, 400 kilometers or so. This one's kind of interesting because we had, there was only a small handful of fish that were released for kind of sorry, Melinda, I'm going to say dog and pony show. Or I can't remember what I told you this morning, but it's essentially a bunch of higher up muckety mucks with the Department of Interior came and they did a ceremonial release up there. But it was kind of interesting that we actually saw one of those fish come into the Platte. Okay, so leading up to more current times, since 2012, there's been a lot of work on the Missouri River, a little bit in the Platte, but what the work in the Missouri is showing that there is a pretty good and consistent concentration of pallid sturgeon around the confluence of the Missouri River, maybe using the Missouri River. Some of the telemetry work actually showed from some of their data logging that water temperatures were correlated to temperatures that we were observed either in the Platte or the Elkhorn River. over those kind of gap years between 2012 and now. Sorry, I'm getting buzzed. And then, so that brought us back around to what we're doing now. And so we have kind of 4 objectives funded through the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. The objectives are essentially to figure out where they're going, how they're using the Platte, try to document if we see spawning behavior, can we catch some larval or eggs of Pallid sturgeon, and then we're all feeding that into a concurrent project with Dr. Ed Heist at Southern Illinois University, where he's doing a bunch of the genetic work. So most of our work on those first 3 objectives is really focused on telemetry, and we're doing both active and passive telemetry with the customary habitat measurements, depth, velocity, water quality, etc. And then where we are seeing some of those fish potentially spawn, we're doing some egg and hopefully larval collection down the road. So we're just now like 6 months or so into field work. We've got 12, and actually as of about 9:30 this morning, we have 13 implanted Pallid sturgeon. The crews are out still this afternoon trying to catch some fish. And so we've mostly caught our fish in the lower part of the river. We will expand that sampling effort up into the well, I guess we call it the Central Platte, but that's probably not the right nomenclature here. The upper lower Platte River, let's say, between the Elkhorn and the Loop River. And so we have a bunch of fish that are out there moving around. We've also got a lot more fish now, and I can't tell you the exact number off the top of my head, but we're probably in the neighborhood of 40 or so, maybe 50 fish that were either tagged by us or the Missouri River program in the that have at least touched the Platte River this year, that we've actually documented through some means of either active or passive tracking. And so we have some listening stations out. These stars indicate where we're looking for the fish on a kind of a full-time basis. This cone looking thing here is a receiver, and we set it out, and it will monitor the fish the whole time. The other bit here you see is our active receiver, nothing too exciting there. A lot of monotonous listening for beeps. And then we're also collecting ichthyoplankton, like I said, and I think that's pretty much it. We have dealt with, in many ways, shapes and forms, the shifting sands in the lower part of the Platte River. Jenna is actually standing in the hole that she dug to get that receiver out. So. And that's one of the shallow holes. So, and that's all I have, I guess, for now. So, stay tuned for more data coming soon.
Thanks, Mark. All right, we've got a couple sessions left here. The next 2 presentations are actually going to be virtual presentations. First one's close to about 15 minutes. The second one is about half of that. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce both of them, and then we'll have basically a video presentation to do. So first one is Andy Little, Assistant Professor, University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and going to be a presentation on precision conservation. The second one will be Jessica Corman, Assistant Professor, University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And I don't have the title of that one, but I'm sure it'll be up there in a second. So,
good afternoon. My name is Dr. Andrew Little, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Today we're going to talk about addressing natural resource conservation needs in multifunctional agricultural landscapes. First, we're going to jump into a little background about my lab, the Applied Wildlife Ecology and Spatial Movement Lab, or as we like to refer to ourselves, the AWESOME Lab at UNL. Then we're going to transition to a discussion on our natural resource challenges in the Midwestern landscape that we're seeing here in the 21st century. And then thirdly, we're going to jump into how we in our lab are addressing these challenges through work in ag technology, conservation, and human dimensions. If you want to go out and check our lab out, just simply go to Google and Google Awesome Lab at UNL, and you'll be able to find our lab website. Additionally, you can go follow us on our various social media accounts shown below at Awesome Lab. And overall, just to give you a little background on our lab, our research mission is to focus on how can we balance the needs of a growing world and feeding that growing world while at the same time ensuring the sustainability of our natural resource systems for future generations. So we'll go ahead and transition and talk a little bit about those natural resource challenges that we're seeing in the 21st century. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these challenges, but we'll go ahead and just go over them briefly before we jump into some of the work that we're actually doing to address some of these challenges. So one of the biggest challenges that we have is habitat loss and degradation. I feel like it's a pretty obvious one. We're seeing a significant decline in available habitat for various wildlife species, and that obviously has impacts for those species. We've seen substantial declines of our grassland bird populations across the Midwest with our expansion of our agricultural systems. But at the same time, we're saying, how can we ensure that sustainability for those species while trying to feed that growing world? We also see that simplification of our ag system. So this is looking at the diversity of crops here on the y-axis. So the larger the number, the more diverse cropping systems we've seen in Nebraska. And this is work from Tim Hiller et al. In 2009. We match that up with more recent data looking at our corn acres over time, and we've seen that basically an inverse relationship dating back into the mid 60s, where we see that decline in the simplification, and then we're seeing that increase in corn acres. And again, if I put up soybeans, we'd have a pretty similar inverse relationship. And again, this seems pretty obvious as you're driving down the road and seeing that simplification of our ag systems. With that, we also see an increasing habitat fragmentation. So we see large intact blocks of grassland cover here. These are noted by green. The yellow are actually agricultural production fields. This is natural land cover data set that we have that we're looking at this data. And so if you're a species like, for example, pheasants, and you live in these little isolated patches, the question is, how do you get from point A to point B? That's obviously a significant challenge in these highly fragmented landscapes. And so obviously that has implications for various wildlife communities. Additionally, we have water quality issues in Nebraska, and I'm sure some of the folks will be talking about some of these issues during this conference. And so we think about how are we going to address these increases in nitrate concentrations that we're seeing across the state of Nebraska. And as I mentioned earlier, we have to think about how do we, though, balance the needs, those natural resource needs, with this growing world population. So we're going to have to increase our food production systems to ensure we can feed that growing world. And I know these numbers change on how many people will be on the planet by 2050, but in general, we're going to have to substantially increase our food production systems to ensure that we can feed that growing world population. So the question really comes down to, how do we sustainably improve our agricultural systems, that production system, to feed that growing world while at the same time balancing those natural resource conservation needs? So it simply comes down to that life is a continuous exercise in creative problem solving, and we really do have to think critically about how are we going to solve these complex problems. So now we're going to go ahead and transition into some of those challenges to how we in our lab are actually addressing these challenges, and how we're really connecting agriculture and conservation through those three pillars that I mentioned about earlier: ag technology, conservation, and human dimensions. So we're first going to go ahead and start with ag technology and how we're leveraging ag technology to strategically target conservation, or as we like to refer to it, precision conservation. One of the things I like to think about when I'm talking about precision conservation is a multi-scale effort. So my position at the university is focused on landscape ecology and habitat management. So I like to think about things in scale and multi-scale efforts. So we have kind of a regional scale, big picture scale. You can kind of look at this as maybe a 30,000 foot scale. And then we have obviously more local or field-based scales where we're trying to strategically implement conservation efforts. So one of the projects we currently have ongoing at the university is this regional scale analysis using the soil productivity data, or the NCCPI data layers that are nationally available, looking at crop commodity productivity index. We obviously have county level yield data, cash rental rates, field input costs, and basically looking at where regionally, and this is image here, shows multiple counties. You can see Lincoln, we have noted here, and then Omaha area. And then we're looking at within this area and saying what areas of this region are potentially useful for us to target conservation delivery. And this effort really is kind of leading to where, for a state or federal or NGO organization, do they prioritize their time and effort. And so now we're taking that data and we're taking aspects of that project and moving that into identifying key factors that are going to influence that kind of regional effort to target conservation. So we can build in other factors like species of interest, parcel size of your land, if you have a certain wildlife habitat suitability rating or percentage. We can look at proximity to urban centers. So if we want to have areas that are closer to or further away from certain areas, we obviously can incorporate that into the modeling effort. And then we think about prioritizing these lands, again, at this regional scale, and then we can drill down into the more local field-based scales. So one of the big key things we like to think about is the species ecology. So if we were thinking about connecting our models to something that's actually beneficial for certain wildlife species, is understanding aspects of their dispersal and movements, survival, resource selection, etc. But then starting building those other factors, as I mentioned about earlier, like distance to metro areas. Additionally, then we can take and add in other data sets like our profitable farm acres. We obviously want to take and maximize the yields on the most profitable acres, and then those marginal acres, that's where we can potentially target for conservation delivery. Eventually, we lead towards building a model that actually produces what we like to call conservation priority areas. So these areas noted in red are parcels that have now met the model criteria that we've developed, and we can strategically target conservation at a regional scale. So we're not kind of doing the shotgun pattern approach. We're actually strategically targeting where we need to focus our efforts. So whether that's actually sending mailers out to landowners that are within these targeted areas, so from a marketing standpoint, for example, or strategically then meeting with those landowners and saying, hey, you're within a conservation priority area. Here are some conservation programs that potentially can benefit you on your marginal acres. So then we can lead from that, again, regional scale hotspot analysis, as we like to refer to it, to then this more local subfield analysis. And basically taking data like yield monitor data and strategically targeting conservation on those marginal acres that producers that are basically losing money on, and they can potentially diversify that system to create a more robust ecosystem. But at the same time, for them financially, because that's going to be a number one driver for most producers, is diversifying and actually ensuring they can maximize overall field and subsequently farm profitability. And then we can lead towards things like conservation cooperatives. So we have multiple landowners that may have similar objectives that are in one of these conservation priority areas, and we can actually work with them to develop these cooperatives so they're learning, peer-to-peer learning engagement opportunities to think about how can we leverage the various strengths and weaknesses of our properties to ensure a sustainable and resilient system for future generations. But again, we have to understand that perspective, the financial perspective, and that's where we have to think about alternative opportunities like grazing acres, ecotourism opportunities, et cetera, that can help generate additional funds for them. Then we can take that work and we can strategically move into how do we think about conservation delivery maybe on those local scales. And so one of the projects that we have currently ongoing that's using that technology and that ag technology is a prairie strip project. And you may be familiar, some of you, with the Iowa State Prairie Strip Program. We are currently in the process of collaborating with them on a large-scale grant. This grant is basically facilitated across a 7-state region. You can see all the partners here that are a part of this grant. And this grant really is 100% extension and focused on how do we expand the footprint of prairie strips, which is a great way to be able to take and strategically target conservation, basically take about 10% up of an agricultural field for conservation. And you can target that on these marginal acres and address things like, water runoff, soil erosion, declining wildlife species, etc. So our work with them, again, it's 100% extension, and we're working to communicate the value of prairie strips across this multi-state region. We are currently in the process of actually rolling out prairie strips across eastern to western Nebraska on a research and extension effort, research and extension properties. And then we'll be able to take that information that we're learning on them and be able to communicate that to a broader audience. And then lastly, to kind of tie all that together, we can obviously do the research and extension efforts, but a part of that extension effort is really engaging those landowners and getting that peer-to-peer learning and engagement and understanding the challenges and the barriers that they have. And that's where human dimensions is so critical. A lot of the folks that I work with, including myself, we're always passionate about the research side, but at the same time, when you're working in a state that's 97% privately owned, thinking of the human dimension side is critical. We obviously have to be able to engage our landowners for conservation success. And so there's been various projects in the past that have looked at, conservation decision-making of ag producers, our non-operating landowners of agricultural lands, and how that may influence decision-making. And currently, we actually have a project with the Nebraska Environmental Trust funded effort to look at Nebraska farmers and farm landowners' attitudes of targeted conservation delivery. And this project is actually helping to better understand those barriers to conservation delivery and finding ways that we can actually think about, innovative approaches to engaging with landowners and moving towards that conservation cooperative effort. So we've talked about these kind of 3 areas of ag technology, conservation, and then our human dimensions efforts. So all this really, again, at a local scale is connecting ag and conservation through things like reducing habitat loss, increasing the profitability for a landowner. That's obviously going to be a significant component of their decision-making process. At a regional scale, we can think about how that improves patch connectivity. So not having these fragmented patches, but having these patches that are now more closely related to each other to facilitate movement amongst them for various wildlife communities. And then helping for our state, federal, and NGO organizations to target the limited financial resources. We obviously don't have money trees out in the back that we can pull out money and be able to pay for just conservation everywhere. So where do we strategically target that? So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. I really appreciate it. Feel free to reach out to me. Here's my email. And again, go follow us at Awesome Lab on our various social media accounts. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jessica Corman. I am an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I'm here to talk about some work I've done with my colleagues, Dr. Steve Thomas and Chris Chisinski, on establishing a water quality monitoring system in the Scottsbluff area. The system is called StreamNet. So the system offers us a pretty unique opportunity to study water quality in a different way because it allows for high frequency monitoring of nitrate, phosphate, ammonium, nutrients that are linked to fertilizer use and wastewater, but also nutrients that can promote growth of harmful cyanobacteria and other organisms in rivers and lakes and other receiving ecosystems. So we built these water quality monitoring systems to look at nutrients, temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, and conductivity, and place them in one of 3 dominant land use areas. So either row crop, and CAFO, so confined animal feed operation, or urban settings. And the system was set up in this past year to look at some of the tributaries that are running off of the northern and southern canals from the region into the river. So the blue line in the center represents the North Platte River. The purple lines represent the canal system, and then the different colored tributaries. So one thing to note here, we have a lot of things going on in this diagram. It's just a really simplified version of the hydrology out in Scotts Bluff. And it also represents some of the areas where we've done some other sampling. I won't talk about that data today, but really just wanted to introduce this system. So there, Steve and I are standing in front of our new lab. That's what it looks like when it's opened up. And water goes through the system, and it determines those nitrate ammonium phosphate concentrations and sends it back through real-time data transmission to an FTP server, so that we have that data sort of, ready for us when we would like to look at it. So we got the sondes. We got 3 of them. We installed them around Scotts Bluff, Geary, and Terrytown, and had them out from about June to August. We've also been working with some students to build a StreamNet website. This is a prototype version of it. It is, you can access it right now, but the data is not live. But the idea is that this data would become live and anyone could use it. So if a storm goes through or something like that, and you're interested in looking at the water quality in a stream, if you live nearby one of these systems, you'd be able to find it out. And here is some very preliminary data from our new lab. So this is phosphorus concentration. And what's really cool here is that you see this diagonal signal of phosphorus kind of increasing till, sometime in the early afternoon, and then decreasing afterwards. And a nice 24-hour signal is happening there. So this is all to say that these systems are really great when they're working. You get lots of high resolution data like we just saw. And from this high resolution data, we can answer things like, what's happening in the stream itself to take up excess nutrients? So that would be biological processes that are happening on a 24-hour cycle. And that's what we're seeing here. And then the longer term signals, right, you can sort of see a larger scale wave across that data. That gets into things like, what are the management practices in this region? Are people, are there things that are happening with where the water levels are going, things like that, that are contributing to those longer time signals. We would also see, so this is just, a few weeks in August, but we'll have monthly records here. We will be able to see things like, increases of phosphorus that might be due to rain, increasing erosion rates across the landscape, or things like that. So yeah, really, really great when these systems are working. But the new labs, they're not for the faint of heart. So I'd love to say we should get these out in streams across Nebraska, because we'd learn a ton of information. But it does take about a month to get each unit up and running. Each unit costs about $50,000. They are not cheap. And it takes a fair amount of personnel time too. So at minimum, they need weekly check-ins on the output to make sure things are working, and maintenance at minimum at monthly schedule to replace the reagents, check to make sure all of the mechanical issues are working well. That being said, Vince Kelly, who's from Green Eyes that built these, he's got a great amount of support for people using these systems. So there's a lot of help that can be had. And the other point that I wanted to make is that security is necessary too. So the systems are run from a battery that is recharged with the solar panel, and we've had our solar panels stolen twice. We've had our batteries stolen a couple times, and we've had the entire housing vandalized and stolen too. Fortunately, when that happened, the sensors weren't in there, so it wasn't as expensive as it could have been, but still not a great situation. So if you're interested in this type of approach, a lot of folks need nutrient management criteria to meet their nutrient management criteria in different areas. These systems can certainly help. I'd be happy to talk more about my experience. And thanks for listening. Bye.
All right. Thank you to Andy and Jessica for those couple presentations. Got a little bit of time here. Go ahead and ask for if we have some questions for Stephen or Mark, since they are still here in person. We can go ahead and take any of those right now. Any questions? Okay, we do have one from Ted. So I'm going to do the dueling mic approach. I'll just walk out both mics. Ted, who's your question for? See if that's on. Yep, should be on.
Fire away, Ted.
I got to ask you a question since you came out here for this. So, but I was curious, historic distribution on the Pallids. I mean, it shows them going the lower Mississippi and then up the Missouri, but not at all up the Mississippi, basically upstream from St. Louis. And just curious why that is. It's still a big river there, and yeah, just curious the ecology or what people think's driving that. So.
Yeah, so there's a huge. Do I need to repeat the question? I guess you. There's at Rock Island, Illinois. There was historically a big rapid there. And that's actually a pretty good demarcation for a transition of lots of other fish species as well. So I think they probably got above it at some point, but not in big enough numbers to establish. So Rock Island is the bottleneck.
Thanks. While we're on that topic, I had a similarly related question, but up on the other end at Lewis and Clark Lake. How did that, you mentioned there was the one individual that had made it down through Lewis and Clark. I can't say I'm 100% familiar with the dam structure there, but can you touch on how that happened and any details you have on that one?
Sure. So it went through the turbines, and people have a misconception that it's like a boat propeller just spinning really fast, but those propellers are huge and they don't turn all that fast, and a lot of fish come through there. We're actually not specifically for pallids, but we're looking at entrainment as what fish are coming through. So I've got a walleye telemetry project going on right now. We've had, I believe, 4 out of about 20 fish move through the dam, and they're swimming around happy as can be by going through the turbines. So it's not an uncommon thing for them to do that. The interesting thing is that the fish move through the actual reservoir part in the upper basin. Pallid sturgeon kind of go into an abyss in Lake Sakakawea on the Missouri River main stem. If they go in there, they just don't seem to come back out. We never see them again. So the fact that this one actually went through and we saw it on the other side was kind of interesting.
Thanks. Other questions?
Sorry for my ignorance. I'm kind of a bird person, but how do you catch a pallid sturgeon?
Very carefully. No. So that question was going, or that answer was going right. The short answer is trot lines. We use baited trot lines, and we target very specific thermal conditions. Usually, when the water temperature is above about 15 or so degrees C, other fish will feed really readily and they'll steal our worms. But once it drops or comes up, depending on which season you're in, comes up to like 5, 6 C up to that 15 or so, pretty much only catch, not just pallids, but pallids and shovel nose. So that's probably the tried and true method. We can use like drifted nets as well. There's actually a cease and desist for like electrofishing, which is what we would normally use for most fish. But pallid sturgeon, there's a couple of papers out that show that they're very susceptible to electricity that leads to a high risk of mortality. So trot lines are pretty much the bread and butter.
Other questions? I had one out in the hall I heard from someone earlier for Stephen. It was in relation to Smith Lake. Was that Smith Lake in Nebraska? It's just
Yeah, I said south of Rushville.
okay. Yep. That was
In my first book, I called it Pine Lake because my friends said they would divorce me if I gave the real name of the place. But I think you all can find it if you want to find it.
Yep. Most people are familiar, I think. Just
There is
checking
a
the
Smith Lake at Crescent Lake National Wildlife Refuge, but doesn't have what you would call camping facilities.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a day use area.
Okay. Any other questions? Maybe time for one more before we close things out for the day and let people get on the road if they want. I'm going to quick check the app and make sure I didn't miss anything there. Looks like it has closed out from this session now anyways, so I think we'll go ahead and consider that the indicator that it's time to go. Thank you all for being here today, and look forward to seeing you all the rest of this time.